You are listening to TBR Radio's The TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Ed DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed calls Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy to talk about the Battle of Beersheva. Also discussed is the psychology of battle, the danger of herd panic as it relates to the coronavirus, and the Democrat primary.
You gave me the list of 12 battles, and the Battle of Beersheva in 1917, which was a World War I battle that the British had fought in Palestine, it made number 3 on the list. So how did that battle, how did it rank so highly?
Because the British needed control of the Middle East in order to prosecute the war. The Ottoman Empire, part of our enemies, were trying to expand, and they wanted to go into Egypt, which would have controlled the Suez Canal. That would have made a major impact on the British war effort in Europe because all their troops and supplies going from Australia, India, Commonwealth, or the not the Commonwealth at the time, but the countries that were allied with England passed through the Suez Canal. So Egypt was key to England's prosecution of the war. Had the Ottomans taken the Suez Canal, it would have made a major impact supplying England. That meant the supplies would have gone the much longer distance around the Cape in South Africa. So the war in the Mideast became very important for that reason. Of course, the Ottoman Turks had a very large military presence in the Mideast at the time. So it ranked up there in importance because the British had to retain control and kick the Ottomans out of there.
So I'm going to ask you a kind of an unrelated question, but it's a curiosity question now, and also it may or may not affect the motivations for the battle and so forth. The Suez Canal, then, it sounds like predated the Panama Canal?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And the Suez Canal was dug like the Panama Canal was. In other words, it's not a natural body it's not a natural waterway, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And so was the Panama Canal inspired in any way by the Suez Canal, or?
Oh, I'm sure it was, because the French, the British were all interested in trade, and the French wanted to get their canals dug too, and they just couldn't do it. Cost, disease, technology, and then we came in and picked up the Panama Canal, and then kept it until Jimmy Carter gave it back to the Panamanians, and now the Chinese kind of own it. But they were very, very important for trade in moving naval forces between the oceans.
So then, whose idea was it to build the not the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal? Was that was Europeans then who had driven that idea?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The British had an interest in that area. Of course, like all the other colonial powers, they divvied up the Levant. So the French sphere of influence was in Syria, those areas there later on. But the British were very heavily involved in Africa, trying to move between Africa and India, getting their trade route there so they wouldn't have to go around the Cape. And so they were the ones that really got the canal done.
So I'm going to ask you another question as well, and that is, as far as the military usefulness of something like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, is that something that is militarily advantageous, or if you try to run a ship through there, are you just basically putting a big target on it and making it an easy target?
Yes to both of those. Yeah, they are definitely constrained when they're going through the canal, and that makes them a target. So it's very easy for an opposing force to shut down the movement by sinking a ship in the channel. They're not very wide. They are important for strategic movement of forces. Operationally, they're important for the forces in that area, but strategically, to move our ships from one ocean to the other, they're very important even today.
And so then, so you said that the Suez Canal was, the motivation, I guess, was part of the motivation to control the Suez Canal for this battle. Before we get started into the details of the battle itself, I want to ask you another question, and that is, just given the players involved, the British the Palestinians, the Egyptians. Was the outcome of this battle something that set up what we would call in our modern day Zionism? In other words, the political movement that resulted in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, or totally unrelated?
Very, very indirectly, yes. The answer is yes, because the result, not just of the battle, but the campaign in the Middle East, at the end of World War I, the British, had stuck their hand into this tar pit and thrown the Ottomans out, who had been there for hundreds of years. The question is, what do you do now? And that's when the French got involved, all the colonial powers, to divvy up the spheres of influence. And so the war in Iraq can go back to this World War I period. After the war was over, they took out rulers and started drawing these straight lines on the map, which had no consideration for the people that actually lived near or under the lines on the map. Very tribalistic countries. We tend to view other people as we view ourselves. The United States is an amalgam of different cultures and people who have come here. Well, that's not the way it is in other places. The American experience is very different. It used to be a German was an ethnic German. Today, Germans are ethnically mixed. They have lots of people from the Mideast, people that come there and take their citizenship. That's an American concept. And the same thing in the Mideast. We just, I say we, the Western powers, kind of assumed that, we could divvy up the land among the people that were there by drawing these straight lines. But many of the people that lived there were intermingled, and so the tribes moved around, crossed those lines. They didn't see a line on the ground. It didn't matter to them. So that led to all these major conflicts we have today. You see these straight lines that on the map, denote the country of Syria, Iraq, Jordan. They're just lines on the map, but they don't have any real relation to reality of who lived there. The people underneath those lines are split in many cases. The tribes lived on both sides of the line, but it set us up for the problems we have today. The consequence of winning was that we as the Western powers, and I include ourselves, we're stuck with this problem. How do you deal with what used to be the Ottoman Empire, where there were no lines on the ground? It all belonged to Turkey. How do you take that and divvy it up into countries? And so it became quite messy.
Well, even Iran and Iraq, Persia, had been a singular place,
exactly.
And the British had chopped that up. And
yes, exactly.
You criticize people like Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler, but you could also make the argument that they were just trying to move the lines, if you will, to back where they were before, other powers like the British and the French had gone meddling with the maps.
Yep, exactly. We used to poke fun at our British Army friends when we were doing exercises, saying, you're the ones that caused this problem because you drew all these lines that don't relate to reality. I mean, the people there underneath the lines had no say. We went in there, and I say we, the Western powers, when the Allies won the war, the people in the Mideast, came under their jurisdiction, as an occupying force. They had no vote where those lines went.
What was the motivation, if you will, for the lines being drawn where they were drawn?
Colonialization, imperialism. Where can you get the most influence to get things that you need? And so the French, wanted their piece of the pie because the British already had the Suez Canal and Egypt. So they said, well, we need to balance it off. We need a piece of that pie too. And there were no recognized countries there. The Ottomans, like I said, it was all kind of an amorphous blob that belonged to Turkey. And so what they did is went in and said, hey, we need our piece of the pie. We're going to take what becomes Syria. So that became a recognized place that the British allowed the French to go into to have their say.
Tell us about, basically the battle. Of course, World War I was a different reality, than modern day warfare. I guess, give us the actual, lowdown as to how this battle was fought. I mean, was it fought in trenches like the European warfare? Was it fought on the backs of camels? What did they...
Yes to your question.
Okay.
Yeah, it was all of those things. Interestingly enough, Beersheba was really key to the Turkish defense line. The British tried unsuccessfully to invade Turkey, and they landed at Gallipoli, and they, for about a 9-month campaign, tried to invade Turkey, and the Turks thwarted that, kicked the British forces or the imperial forces out of Turkey, and so it was a major disaster for the British. They pulled out by Christmas of 1915, and the next problem they had is, where do we go now? So they went to Egypt and said, what we'll do is we will come up through the underbelly of the Ottoman Empire and go around. But first they had to defend the canal because the Turkish-German army and the Germans, being allies of the Turks, had some forces there with the Turks to help, and had a lot of advisors also. Were trying to seize the canal. So the first thing the imperial forces had to do is defend the canal against the Turkish invasion. They did that successfully, and then the next step was a counteroffensive to go against the Ottomans. In conjunction with what was happening on the Western Front in Europe, they also were fighting a major campaign in the Middle East, which is largely overlooked by people. They forget that World War I was fought in the Middle East. There were huge battles there. And so the British started moving slowly after they defended the canal successfully to push the Ottomans out, and they pushed the forces back up into what we now know is the modern state of Israel. Beersheva was one of the defensive pieces because it was out in the desert, the last place that water could be had for miles and miles. So between the line of Gaza, the Gaza defense line, which is right on the coast, out into the desert, was a line that ran to the town of Beersheba. It became a key component of the Turkish defense line. They knew that if you didn't have the wells at Beersheba, and you remember from Bible times, that the oath on the wells of Beersheba, that was a very important place because that was the last place you could find water for miles. And if you go east of that, there's literally no water. So you had to have the water for all the animals. Remember, everything was horse-drawn or camel-drawn back then. Very little mechanization. So horses played an important part, as well as the men. You couldn't go out into the desert without having water for all those hundreds of thousands of men. So the Turks drew a line on the map from Gaza to Beersheba, and that was their defensive line. They dug trenches. So the answer to your question is yes, they had trenches. It was not like Europe where they were tied in from the North Sea all the way down to Switzerland. In the desert, there were strong points and there were trenches around them, and then between them, they patrolled. It wasn't a single line of trenches from Gaza to Beersheba.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Where was Beersheva located? If you were to put it on a modern-day map, where would you tell people to look for it?
I'm trying to remember the exact distance, but about 40 miles west of Gaza. So if you find Gaza on the map, which now is outside of Israel, and you draw a line from Gaza to the southeast, it hits Beersheva. And out to the southeast of Beersheba, going southeast, is just open desert.
The Ottomans were the Turks.
Yes.
And as I understand it, and I read just, a real brief Wikipedia article just to know, what we would be talking about a little bit. Were the British forces actually engaged in this battle, or was this Egyptians, a division of the Egyptian army that was basically fighting for the British?
It was British, and they had Australians with them. In fact, the Australians consider this campaign, because they were heavily involved, is key to one of the keys to their military history, and they're very proud of it because they had a corps of soldiers there, and one of their commanders, named Grant, later became extremely well known and served on in the Australian Army for years after that. But they were key to the Battle of Beersheba. If I had to wicker it down to who won the battle, the Australians actually were the ones who won the battle.
Were the British on the ground at all, or did they just totally have other people fighting for them? Or, I mean, I realize that Australia was part of Britain, and Egypt may have even been controlled by Britain at that point. But I'm talking like actual, British people from the island, if you will. Were any of them on the ground, or did they just let the foreigners?
Oh, yes. There are two main corps, and I say a corps made up of divisions. And so we're talking, a corps is a huge organization. We're talking of thousands of men, and I would guesstimate the corps back then, 20,000 men in a corps, approximately. Okay. They're not a fixed organization. They would add or subtract divisions as needed, much as we do today in corps. So we're talking about a huge organization. The British had a corps, 20th Corps, and then the Desert Mounted Corps, DMC, was mainly, not all, but mainly New Zealand and Australian troops with a brigade of British cavalry. The Australians and New Zealanders were known as ANZAC. It's Australian New Zealand Army Corps, which is, very famous from their military history. So when you talk about ANZACs, it's the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. They were formed mainly by mounted infantry, not cavalry, which was different. And that, if you ever see the movie, The Light Horseman, it brings it out very well in this movie. I think the movie came out in 1987. It's a somewhat fictionalized account based on true people and circumstances, but it shows the mounted infantry. But they fought dismounted. They rode to battle and fought dismounted until the Battle of Beersheba, which is very interesting. The Australians in the battle at Beersheba actually charged on horseback the German Turkish lines. That was totally against their doctrine. So they kind of broke the rules, but they won the battle by doing so, which is what the Australians are really known for, being very innovative in that sense.
Were there any other allies involved in that engagement, or was it all British forces, or were there Americans there? Were there, French there? Were there other allies there?
No, it was all British. They came under the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, the EEF. And at the Battle of Beersheba, Allenby was the commander. He had replaced the previous commander who had failed in his attempts to attack Gaza previously. And Allenby came up with this plan to outflank the Turkish defenses instead of going straight at them. The previous commander, Archibald Murray, tried to attack frontally, which was a disaster, and they were pushed back. Allenby replaced him and decided to do this large sweeping movement out into the desert, and it was a huge risk because there were no supply lines. The roads were non-existent. They were trails, camel trails. And so how do you take this large force that requires hundreds of millions of gallons of water and get them all the way around the Turkish flank while supplying them. Because if you run out of water, they have to withdraw or they die. That's all, the choices. You either have water or you die. So if they don't capture the wells at Beersheba in a timely fashion, everyone is out of water, and the only choice they really have is to withdraw. They lose. So Allenby, in the movie brings us out. There's some. I love the Australian war movies because, unlike Hollywood, they stick pretty close to what actually happened. And yes, there's a little bit of Hollywoodism. I don't know what it would be called in Australia, but the movie brings us out. They actually used a large bit of deception. Their Army intelligence officer was a guy named Richard Meinertagen, and sounds German, but his family was actually Danish and had moved to England. And Meinertagen came up with a plan. He says, we can cause a major deception by doing these things. And it wasn't just one thing, but his part of the deception was he rode into the desert with a Australian patrol intentionally to be seen by the Turks. And the Turkish cavalry chased them, and he pretended to drop his dispatch case. But it wasn't pretending. He actually intended to do it. And it had the fake plans in the case. And the Turks bought into it. They actually believed what they captured was true. So that helped the Australians to sneak around, so to speak, get around the flank to Beersheba. If they could capture Beersheba, they capture the wells, and that allows them to outflank Gaza and get around the rear of the British and Turks, causing the British and Turks to have to withdraw. They can't stay there without being captured.
And so you'd mentioned the Australians and the Australian movie. From what I understood, from what little bit I read, apparently even to the modern day, the Australian military considers this to be one of their greatest achievements or successes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it ranks up there. We talk about Gettysburg. This is Beersheva is their big battle. That's the one in history they really pin their hats to. There's others. I mean, they did remarkable things in Europe as well. But, the Western Front kind of subsumes all the history of the Middle East. This was a major event that the Australians conducted in this charge to Beersheba. Because what happened is the British line, mainly infantry, that was attacking on the left flank of the Australians as they were heading north into Gaza, was really kind of stymied by the defenses of Gaza. The infantry wasn't making a lot of headway. So it was imperative that the British mounted infantry get around Beersheba and cause the flank to collapse. So it would cause the Turks and the Germans to have to face in another direction to fight. And they couldn't do that, so they would have to withdraw. So the Australians went to Beersheba, the very end of the line. There's nothing out in the desert past it. And at the end of the day, they had not been able to make any headway against the Turkish defenses. So the brigade commander named Grant, the British or the Australian brigade commander, decided with his unit to conduct a mounted charge, which they had never done. They had never done this. It was not part of their doctrine. These are mounted infantry, not cavalry. And cavalry against modern defenses, machine guns and wire, just didn't work. And they found out in Europe it didn't work well at all. So the cavalry had largely been put into reserves. They were no longer fighting on the front, except dismounted. Grant was he was in a real predicament. The sun was about ready to go down. If they did not capture the wells on that day, they would have had to have admitted defeat and withdrawn. And Grant said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to charge. And against the the advice of several people saying you can't do that, he said, yes, we can. Now, some of the mitigating factors for a successful charge was that the Turks and Germans had run out of barbed wire. They didn't have a whole lot in front of their defenses. So unlike in the Western Front where barbed wire was stacked deeply, there were very little obstacles to movement there. But they did go up against machine guns and dug-in infantry and trench infantry.
And so you're talking about a major cavalry movement. In that part of the world, is the cavalry on horseback or is it on camelback?
Interesting you ask that. Desert Mounted Corps had both camel-mounted infantry and horse-mounted infantry. But the reason they used the animals was to move the soldiers to a particular battle to fight, and then they would dismount them and then fight as infantry. They were called mounted infantry. So it's like driving a taxi cab and getting out and then going to fight. But in this battle, for the first time ever, the Australians decided to charge on horseback, which is not the way they were supposed to do it. That's what the manuals said you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to go to the battle, get off the horse, and fight. But Grant said, we don't have time. We're going to take a huge risk, and we're going to do it. So the objective was ride the horses to the actual German-Turkish trenches and dismount there and fight, which was a huge risk. They'd never done it before. They weren't trained to do it. But they just pulled it out and said, hey, we're going to charge the trenches. And the Australian soldiers, being the way they were, pulled their bayonets out. And you kind of laughed, but a bayonet back then on an Enfield rifle was 18 inches long. It was pretty big. And so they used their bayonets like swords. And they charged the German and Turkish positions. And they did it so quickly. And in the movie this comes out, the German intelligence officer that's stationed in Beersheva said they saw the Australian light horse units lining up to charge, and he said they will not charge because he knew what their doctrine was. The doctrine was you ride to the battle, dismount, and fight. He said they won't charge. And the Turkish soldiers were not prepared for a charge. When the Australians charged, it took the Turks and Germans completely, totally by surprise because they knew they were facing mounted infantry, not cavalry. Cavalry charges on horseback, not mounted infantry. So when the Australians did it, it just shocked the German-Turkish defenders. They did not expect that to happen.
And so the horseback there in that part of the world is fighting. Are horses well suited to that area, or are they not? Or the fact that there was a well nearby, they were able to keep them hydrated and it didn't matter?
Well,
you said the manuals told them not to fight on horseback. So did they get lucky, or?
I think there was some luck involved, I'm sure, but it was surprise because the enemy in the military, we call it templating the enemy. We know how the enemy fights by reading his doctrine and looking at the way they do things. But the Australians broke the template. See, the German intelligence said, this is Australian light horse. We know how they fight because we've been fighting them for 2 years here in the desert. We know that their doctrine says, the manual says, they ride to the battlefield, they get off their horses, and then they go into combat. The horses don't go near the battle because that's their means of mobility, and you don't want to lose your horse, so they don't want to get them shot. So the Germans and the intelligence officer and the German advisors are telling the Turks, these are light horse, they're not going to charge us. And boom, the Australians did exactly that. Because they broke the template, they were successful.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
So when you teach this battle, as a professor of military history, you taught this battle for a number of years. Was it just, what were you teaching? What lessons were you using this battle to teach?
Oh, that's a good question, because what we talk about is using initiative and creativity to solve problems. The British were sticking to the manuals. The way they did things was very much oriented on what they had in their doctrine. And this is typical of many militaries. they were hesitant to deviate from the manual, because if you went by the manual and you failed, you can always go back to, hey, we did what the book says, and it just didn't work out. So no one's going to be able to really point fingers at you and find fault. But the Australians weren't bound by the manuals. They said, that doesn't make sense. We will do it this way instead. So Grant took a huge risk, but he also, if he had failed, he would have been susceptible to a great deal of criticism, maybe even relieved from command for violating the doctrine. But he said, this is the way we do it. So the lessons learned are really interesting because we can apply that to today. We get wedded sometimes to the way we do things, and we think that's the only way it can be done in the military. But sometimes there's novel and innovative ways to solve the problems that are not in the manuals, depending on the situation.
The British, you talk about being a slave to their manuals. That seems to be a trend with them. I mean, even if you look at even like the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, you look at the Napoleonic Wars, you see a lot of British defeats where they just didn't seem able to adapt, obviously to the warfare of the location where they were at.
In a gross general term, I'd say yes, that's absolutely true. They've changed quite a bit. I think after World War II, they have significantly changed their outlook and attitudes. And I've worked with the British Army. They're great guys, very smart. And I think they've come around. I think they understand that was a problem in their army before. They had been stuck to the efficacy of following the book, so to speak. And now they understand that creativity is sometimes a much better trait to have.
And so you had talked about I know we're kind of bouncing a little bit here, but you had talked about how a lot of the modern day wars can even trace back to this battle at Beersheva and some other wars of that time period. And we talked about, the British, they basically took the Middle East and they drew a bunch of straight lines and they chopped it up. Do you think that today the British, and if that's the case even now, the Americans as well, are fighting because we're trying to maintain, I'll just say it, the mistakes that the British made over 100 years ago now?
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I'd say they're related. Our national interest in the Mideast has been driven since World War II heavily by the oil there, the resources. Otherwise, I don't think we give a hoot. Other than the Suez Canal, I don't think we give a hoot. The formation of the State of Israel in 1948, we were the first nation to recognize them as a sovereign country. So now we have a stake in the Mideast because of that as well. But the result of World War I and the partition of the Ottoman Empire has caused many of the problems that we run into, because it was not based on the lines regarding the culture or the people that lived in the area. It just said, it lumped all these people together and said, poof, you now belong to this new country that we're making.
And so oil, then, you're saying, was not a motivation in World War I and before that?
No, not really. Not to the degree it is today.
And I understand the motivation for Beersheba was wells and water. To go beyond that, you don't need water in that part of the world if you're not in that part of the world to begin with. So what brought them to that part of the world if it wasn't oil? Was it just pure conquest or colonialism, or was it something else?
The defense of the Suez Canal and the trade routes to India and the Pacific, maintaining that area, keeping the Ottomans out. And once you grab hold of them, you can't just let them go as part of the war effort. They wanted to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war as early as possible, right, so that they could turn around and send those troops to fight in France against the main enemy, the Germans. So if they could knock Turkey out as quickly as possible, they could reallocate the forces from the Mideast to the European theater. But they had to keep the Turks away from the Suez Canal.
And so were the Turks allied with the Germans before all this began, or did Germany come to the assistance of the Turks, realizing that, that there was that obviously that area had a strategic advantage to their enemy, and then the Turks became a natural ally for the Germans. How did that German-Turkish alliance come to be?
Well, it was strictly a World War One alliance. They had relations prior to that, and I'm trying to think when the first mission was sent to Turkey by the Germans, but it was prior to the war. They had gone back a number of years where the Germans had agreed to provide training missions to the Turks and help the Turkish army. When the war started, the Germans, were very keen to keep the Turkish as allies because it was a major threat to the British in the Mideast. And they knew the Suez Canal was kind of the lifeline for the empire, and hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers fought in the British army. The Indian army, which was part of the British Empire, came to the assistance of the British and fought in Europe. So you have hundreds of thousands of these Turkish or Indian soldiers fighting against the Germans.
And so had the British attempted any diplomatic outreaches to the Turks before the military option was exercised? Or, in other words, why did they have to be enemies and not allies with the Turks to begin with?
Trade, but the main thing was the counterbalance to the Russians, the Russian Empire. I'd have to go back and do some more reading on it, but the Russians had fought against the British, in the Crimean War. They were seen as the threat, in that part of the world, and so Turkey would provide a counterbalance to Russian incursion into that area. So if the Germans, could keep some influence in Turkey, that would prevent the Russians from getting their influence into the Balkans and those areas. It's a complex issue, and I'm not prepared to really talk about that. But I do know that even though the Germans were there during the war, they did have a pre-war presence in Turkey with their military missions.
I guess the bigger question, and I always ask this question whenever I look at World War I or, the Bolshevik Revolution or, any of these things that were happening, the slaughter of the Romanovs or whatever. Why, for example, the Russians and the British, or the Russians and any of the other Western European powers, why would they have even been at odds at each other? Because all of their royal families were cousins. So
that is amazing.
Were these family disputes that went bad, or?
No, it would be kind of fun to say, yeah, they were, but no, in fact, it's just kind of interesting that it turned out that way. Yes, they were all interrelated in some way or another. I think they were all proud of their countries, despite the fact they had cousins and, relations on the other sides. They saw themselves as Russians or Germans, not this one world business where we're all, friends. They had their own interest, and they were pushing their own country's interest.
So have you ever personally gone over there and done any tours of the battlefield, or is this something that has strictly been an academic study for you?
Well, I went to the Israeli Army Armored Commanders course. And so I had known about the battle prior to going, but I actually went to the battlefield when I was in the Israeli Army Armored course. And so I've been on the battlefield, walked it over, and it's amazing because it happened after 73 AD and before 1948. To the Israelis, it's kind of non-history.
Okay, so I kind of find that interesting that's their...
Yeah. It sits right in their backyard, but it's not really their history. So you don't see a lot of memorials or commemorations or, markers on the battlefield. If you don't know what you're looking at, you could just drive right past it. There are things there, but it's been put up by the British and the Australians, New Zealanders, to commemorate the battle. You have to be looking for it to see it.
So that it's not like, when you go to Gettysburg or when you go to Shiloh or, when you go to different battlefields here in the United States, it's not preserved in any way. And so since this was not history to the Israelis, what was their response when you asked somebody to take you out to the battlefield, or did you just go out there by yourself?
No, they took us. They were, happy enough to oblige us. Like I said, it's not their history, so it's kind of like, yeah, it happened here, but that's not us. So I didn't find a lot of interest in it. It wasn't anything that really kind of pushed their buttons and turned them on. It was, we did talk a lot about the 1948 War of Independence and, what was going on in the following wars where the Israelis were fighting. And in 1948, there was a lot of fighting around Beersheba. So they could talk about that, and they were interested in that, and that was good. But World War I, yeah, they heard about it happening there. That was about it. They knew nothing about the battle or, the significance of it.
So have you ever taken students there, or was this a campaign that you spent a lot of time in the classroom talking about, or is this more of a personal interest?
It was more of a personal interest, and I did, use the examples in our classes. And having gone there, actually walked over the ground or driven over the ground, really, I have a more intense interest because I've been there. It's like going to Gettysburg. If you've ever been there, then you watch the movie Gettysburg, and it means a lot more to you because you've actually been to the ground, so you understand it. I'd love to go back, and they had a commemoration in 2017. The Australians had a bunch of Australians go there and actually ride the battlefield on horseback. Reenactors go back there and do that. But, here in America, no one paid attention to it, unfortunately.
So was it a full-scale reenactment, or was it just they rode the battlefield kind of just in ceremony, or?
It was more of a ceremonial thing, and it was a small group. I can't imagine, just looking at the videos online, that it was more than about 30, 40 people, but they represented, the Australians in World War I that fought there. So
they were the actual veterans then who did the ride?
Oh no. These were reenactors. They were young guys.
Okay, all the Australian, I was going to say, all those guys would have to have been, over 100 years old to have been the original guys.
They're all. Yeah, the last Australian veteran died a couple of years ago.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
You watch the History Channel, or you read magazines and so forth. You read books. World War II still gets a lot of ink and a lot of film, but World War I's almost been forgotten.
It has been, and that's the shame. I work on our county military heritage commission, and one of our charters is to go into the schools and make sure these wars and the people who fought in them are not forgotten. But yes, you're right, because the young people today are so distanced from anyone who fought. This was my grandfather's generation that fought in that war. I had a great uncle who served. So, our tie is kind of tenuous. I never knew these men other than for a couple of years before they passed, but now my kids never knew them at all. And they knew my father, who was a World War II veteran, but now that he's gone, my grandkids won't have a connection to him. So unfortunately, time is hurting us, because the further we get away, there's no personal relationship with these people. And World War I has largely been forgotten in the United States. Very, very few commemorations this last centennial. When
I was a kid, my great-grandfather had a trunk. And I remember going to his house, at different times, and there was this trunk, and I can remember, going through the things in the trunk a few times in my childhood, there was a helmet with a spike on it, and there was an old pistol in there that was rusted up and didn't work or whatever. But it was in a dried out leather holster, and
oh no, I hope you still have those.
I don't know what happened to those things. I'm sure that my cousins probably raided that stuff. I'll tell you what happened is when he died, and I was in my early 20s when he passed away. That would have been around 1996, and all of that stuff went to my grandparents. And then when my grandfather died, my cousins all went in and pretty much raided everything before they even told me he had died.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, it was, my cousin, of course, I was living in Florida, and, my cousins were there locally, and they knew, of course, that he had made arrangements for me to take care of just about everything. And so they figured they better go in there and clean everything out before they even told me he had passed, and I knew that I needed to be doing anything. So,
oh golly,
yeah. So I don't know what happened to those things, but yeah, I remember but they were the souvenirs that my great grandfather had gathered, I guess, from a German soldier at some point and brought them home as souvenirs. But even he, to have fought in that war. I think he was like 15 when he enlisted in the army, and he lied about his age, and they sent him to Europe to fight. I don't really remember him telling a lot of war stories. That was the only direct connection that I had to World War I, and it was not, even necessarily a strong one.
And the war was much smaller than World War II for us because we only had about a quarter of the number of people mobilized that we did in World War II. So the number of veterans were fewer. At the end of the war, we only had about 25% of what we sent off to World War II. The impact wasn't as great. And of course, the war for us was only a year and a half long from the time we entered it, even though it had been going on for several years in Europe. We got in at the very last. And so to the British, or the Commonwealth or the Germans, it was a significant emotional event, and they lost, a lot of people because they were in it much longer than we were.
Sail on a 2-night Bahamas Paradise cruise from just $149. Cruise and Bahamas resort stay options also available at amazing prices. Call 800-814-7100. That's 800-814-7100.
Is there something in our conversation, maybe a question that I should have asked you and that I didn't ask, or something about this battle that you wanted to point out and I haven't given you the opportunity yet?
Not so much the battle, but the strategic situation. Turkey was a key player because of the Bosphorus Straits going from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And the Russians being an ally with us at the beginning of the war, until 1917, October Revolution of 1917, they remained on our side, and then they were knocked out of the war. But the Russians' interest in the Balkans and having the Bosphorus Straits as access to the Mediterranean caused a great deal of consternation, which is why the Gallipoli campaign was mounted. The Allied powers wanted to keep the straits open so that we could move with the Russians between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. If the Turks and Germans cut that off, that caused a major problem for us, in that part of the Balkans. And so that, along with the Suez Canal, were major factors in why the British were there and why we ended up in Beersheba in October 1917. I say we, I keep saying we, but it's really the British. They're our allies. There's a huge war that goes on in the Mideast that many people do not even talk about because they're, overwhelmed with what happened on the Western Front. Where we actually fought in the war was in Europe. So we had no troops in the Middle East at this time. But it was a major part of the war.
Not so much that I'm trying to change the subject, but we are kind of running towards the end of our program time today. You're a military man. Give me a quick perspective from a military man on the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's a danger right now. I keep watching the news, seeing how they're going to do this.
Yeah. So I don't know. I figure one of two things is going on. Either, the governor, the president, whoever, either they're operating on a level of information that we just don't have, and this is the biggest catastrophe in the history of the world, and they're just not telling us that because they don't want us to be any more panicked than we already are.
Yep.
Or this is the biggest overreaction in the history of the world because it's basically just the flu, and more people got shot in Chicago over the weekend than have died of the coronavirus, since the whole thing started.
Panic is a herd instinct. I was talking to some other friends about this, and you can see what we talk about this in the psychology of battle. What happens if a unit panics and people, lose their senses? And that's what's happening right now. I went to the store yesterday to get some groceries, and it's just incredible. And I'm going, okay, so they've got like 5 months of groceries in their house. They shouldn't be back to the store, and they're going to restock the store in a day or two. It'll be restocked. I said, what are they going to do then? Are they going to come back and keep buying? They've already got stuff for 5 months. So hopefully they got it out of their system, and the store will be restocked in a day or two. I'll go back and get my groceries again.
Day before yesterday, we had one of the ladies at church that went to buy some groceries because we had a youth activity yesterday, and so we were going to take all the young people to Ocean City. But then the governor had ordered all the restaurants closed, so we knew that we weren't going to be able to take them to get pizza. And so one of the ladies went, and she bought stuff to, make sandwiches and other things. And I don't know how many pounds of lunch meat she bought. She probably bought about 15 pounds of lunch meat and, a bunch of cheese and, several loaves of bread and some things. And she was saying how people in the store were giving her dirty looks and how, any other time had she done that, it wouldn't have been a big deal.
But all of
I
a
guess
sudden,
she was like trying to hoard lunch meat or whatever. So anyways, the long story short is her son is the manager of another grocery store in their chain a little bit further down in the state.
Yeah.
And so the manager at the store where she was shopping, I guess, called the manager of the other store where her son's the manager. And he's like, yeah, my mom's probably, if she says she's in there shopping for church, she probably is. And so they finally decided to let her buy buy whatever. But she's like, any other day, that would not have been a big deal.
No, it would have been, you're having a party or, some get together. Well, there was I don't know what the big deal about the toilet paper is. I laugh. But, the president got on the news and said, hey, there's plenty of stuff. It's just the problem of getting it to the stores to replace what's been taken. It'll get there. And, it may take a day or two longer, but, they'll have the shelves restocked in about 2 or 3 days. They said, come back, we'll get this stuff in. And there's not a lack of it. It's just that now people are hoarding. And I laugh. I thought about making a YouTube video on how to make toilet paper out of newspaper with a paper cutter.
Well, maybe this was an attempt at humor probably, and it actually was pretty funny. I said we took the young people to Ocean City. We ended up we were going to play mini golf and do some other things down there, but a lot of things were closed, so we ended up taking the kids to this video game arcade. Mm-hmm. And, they play the games and you get tickets and, you go up and you cash in the tickets for stuff. And there was a claw machine in there. Actually, there were several claw machines, but one of the claw machines, they had filled it, instead of with little stuffed toys, they had filled it with rolls of toilet paper.
That's
and
funny.
Then they also had packages of toilet paper in the prize section so you could redeem your tickets for a roll or a package of toilet paper.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, I was joking with some of my Army buddies because in the old days they issued toilet paper in your rations. Well, they still do, but we were joking about, you got cigarettes and you got toilet paper, and those were things that you always kept. You never threw it away. And they came in little bitty packs. I mean, little bitty sheets. So we were kind of joking about that. I was saying, gosh, I wish I'd saved all those because I hoarded my toilet paper for several years. I kept that stuff thinking, gosh, if there's a national disaster, I'll have it. Well, that was 30, 40 years ago. I wish I'd kept all that stuff. but it came in a little bitty roll. I'll have to send a picture to you. Came in a little roll wrapped, and it said, packed by the Lighthouse for the Blind or something on the little roll, because it was contracted out. And it was just, a few sheets of this really bad paper, cheap paper.
Well, I was joking with some people last Sunday at church. One of our ladies was saying how, she buys a 16 pack of toilet paper.
Yeah.
And it lasts her family a month. She's like, so, why does somebody have to go in and, buy, 10 packages of toilet paper? But I said, what's even crazier? I said, I go to Cuba. I don't think there are 16 rolls of toilet paper on the whole island, but yet the whole country survives somehow.
Yeah. Lots of leaves. They got lots of leaves on their trees.
Yeah, so. Yeah. But anyways, it was good. It was good chatting with you, and I guess next month I'll figure out a time and we'll do it again. You had the raid on Hammelburg and the rescue of Patton's son-in-law.
Oh yeah. I just read another account on it. That's one of my favorites. I've been there too.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to doing that next month then. But I guess if you need anything between now and then, I guess just reach out to me and let me know. The news feed's coming up here in the corner of my screen now, and I've got just a couple minutes left here in the broadcast, but I'll go ahead and throw the question out to you since it just hit my screen. This whole Joe Biden comeback. I mean, do you have an opinion on that? The Democrat primary, do you have an opinion on it?
Oh, I'm sure the Sanders people are going to be upset again, that this guy didn't get it. And what shocks me is the number of people in the United States that think this guy's all right. I'm shocked. They don't know what a communist is. I'm just amazed. If they called him a Nazi, he wouldn't have been given the time of day. Mm-hmm. They don't see the difference between National Socialist and International Socialist. They're all of the same ilk. They're socialists. And this guy's a communist, which just amazes me. But the Democrat Party's gone that way.
Well, what people don't realize is that until last night, Sanders had still won more delegates than Biden, because Biden got his delegate jump when Buttigieg and Bloomberg and Klobuchar and everybody endorsed him.
Right.
So those weren't delegates that he had won, and even having exceeded Bernie in number of delegates won last night, I mean it's still it's still close enough, and then you look at the fact that you look at the number of Democrats that are voting in the primary. There weren't but a few thousand people who even voted in Florida yesterday. So, even if Biden ends up running away with this primary, that the Democrats think that he's going to stand a chance in a general election unless they just have a fail-safe, foolproof way to rig it.
And I keep waiting for them to pull Hillary out of the closet.
Yeah.
And I seriously think they are considering that. But Biden said he's going to pick a woman of color to be his vice president. I mean, this guy's pandering, right and left. It's just incredible. Just incredible.
With that is about all of the time that we have for this week's TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. Enjoyed, as always, the conversation with my good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy. And he always has some great insights. I always have him on here at the end of the month to share another battle account with us. And anyways, if you will go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org, you'll be able to check out our website, check out our bookstore, find out how you can subscribe to the Barnes Review, and so much more. Also, I want to say thank you. There was somebody who has just given a very generous contribution to TBR, and your generous contribution is what's going to be keeping this show on the air for the next 6 months. And so I want to say thank you, whoever you are, for that, and just throw it out there. You support all kinds of things. Why don't you support something that is putting the truth out there, the truth that you believe and that you want others to hear as well? And so if you've ever thought about a cause that you could support, TBR is definitely a good one. So when you go to the TBR website, barnesreview.org, you can also check out how you can make a contribution to the Barnes Review and keep the radio show on the air, keep the magazines going out, keep the truth going out to the masses. Anyways, like I said a few moments ago, we are out of time. So from all of us here at TBR Radio, until next week, God bless. See you soon.